The purpose of today's call is for us to go over generic inquiries, and then the generic inquiry is really the start of what could become a formal report, which could be produced either to export out to a PDF file or an Excel file. Also looking at my screen now, you'll notice all of these dashboards that we see on the screen. Behind them are all generic inquiries. So again, it's basically just a way to query the data. And a generic inquiry is really just a wizard that helps us build what's essentially a SQL command selecting data from the database. So really my goal here is just to give you some high-level information about generic inquiries. This should help you be able to modify current generic inquiries, look at how generic inquiries are being used, so to understand kind of where the data is, make changes as needed. I want to give you some tips about how to find the data. If we simply just look at, and I'm just going to click on our receivables and I'm going to click on our customers, and we're in a test system right now, so no fear of us making any changes that could potentially cause an issue. What we're seeing here on the screen is nothing more than just a generic inquiry. The system behind the scenes has built some type of query which has gone in and pulled information from probably several different tables in the system, and then it has determined which fields it wants to make available on the screen, as well as what fields it has queried, but we may not necessarily see as a default. And then of course we can always filter these screens by any one of the columns, and we can export out. But up at the top right where we see this is customization, and depending on your access to the system, this may not be available to you, but for anybody with administrative access or customization access does have access to it. So if we click on customization, you can see there's this edit generic inquiry option. And so what that's going to do is it's going to take us to the generic inquiry screen for our AR-customers. And so I'm going to go through this just so that we have a good understanding of what the generic inquiry is made up of, and then we'll kind of look at a few other examples. So the inquiry title is nothing more than what is this generic inquiry titled. The option to make it visible to the UI essentially is just that. I can uncheck this or remove this check mark, and it becomes a generic inquiry that's behind the scenes, but nobody can actually access it unless they were to come to the generic inquiry screen here. By making it visible means that I can determine where on the site, which is the next field here, the site map, where do I want it to be visible to the end users. In most cases, anything that we build ourselves are going to be displayed in this data view section up in the top left over here. We can also group it by workplace or category. It's telling us what the screen ID is, and this is generated by the system. So when you build a new generic inquiry, it's automatically going to give it a screen ID. You don't have to worry about putting anything in here. Arrange parameters. These are basically the options at the top where we can choose maybe what customer we want to look at or a date range, things like that. And by default, or at least in this example, it's showing that it's set to 3 different columns. Select top records. So we normally can define how many records is it going to return on that first page when we go and run it. Or I'm sorry, how many records total is it going to query from the database? In most cases, you want to leave this to be 0. That means infinite. It's going to query all of the data. But if you were just playing around with this, you may want to set this to a low number just until you get your queries built. Records per page is, if we were to go back to that customers page, it shows how many customers are listed on each page. We can change this number. Typically, it starts as a pretty low number, but we can increase it. The one warning there is the higher the number is, let's say we were to put it to 500, so that would return 500 customers on that first page. That can somewhat slow the system down when somebody goes and loads that screen. So there's sometimes a nice balance of what is the right number so that they get a lot of results on that first screen, but not so much that it slows the system down or causes you to wait until the screen loads. And then when you export records out or you click on that little Excel button, you can set it to determine how many records to export. By default, the system is always going to try to only export the top 1,000 records. It will give you a warning saying that's what it's trying to do, and you can override that warning to say, no, I want to export the entire list. But in this case, you can set it to a certain number. We also have the ability to show deleted records. So in the actual SQL tables behind Acumatica, when you delete a record, it doesn't actually get rid of it. The record still exists. There's just a flag on it called deleted that it marks, and pretty much everywhere in Acumatica, it's never going to show you that record again because it's considered a deleted record. But we have the option of being able to show those deleted records if we wanted to look for maybe if somebody accidentally deleted a record out of the system. These two other options, OData and mobile, are really more advanced. The mobile is if we want to make it visible on our mobile app, and OData would be for if we wanted to push it out to some type of third-party application. At the bottom of the screen, we have all of our tabs here, and this is really how we build our generic inquiry. So the very first one is our tables, and we'll kind of come back to how we determine which tables to use in a little bit. But really what this is nothing more than just a list of the different tables in the SQL database that the system is using. In this case, we're giving our table name and then kind of the alias that the Acumatica has given that table. So our first one is a customer table. We then have an address table, and then we have this BA account table. So these are the three tables that this generic inquiry is using. So all three have data in it that we needed for the results that we wanted to look at. When we have more than one table, we have to link the tables together or build a relationship. So that's our second tab here. So our relationship starts off at the top, showing us what the two tables that we're trying to put together. And this is where things can get a bit complicated. So if you don't necessarily understand tables and which fields are matching, this is where we might get beyond some basic user capabilities. But once you have an understanding of how the tables are related to each other, then you can come in here and we can say that on the customer record, that's this table here, the parent table, we are joining it to the address table. That's the child table over here. And then at the bottom section, we're actually telling it which column or field in each one of these tables equals each other. So in our parent table, the customer table, they're using what's called the default address ID field. And in the child table, the address table, it's using the address ID. And so for our customer record has a default address setting, and that default address is then pointed to the address that's in this table. We then go to the next one in the list, and we're now connecting our customer table to this BA account table. And at the bottom, we're using this parent BA account ID in the customer table and the child BA account. So your top section is really the tables that we've chosen on our tables. So when I highlight this top customer address one, the bottom one updates to say, how do those two tables relate to each other? What value in customers am I matching to a value in child table? Users aren't going to see this. It's just simply saying, I have a customer here and an address. In my customer table, it's default address, that's the field. And in my child, it's address ID. If you're just modifying one, like if I'm coming in and looking at this generic inquiry that was already built, I'm not touching this for the most part. So you may never have to touch this. But if you're building one from scratch, you're going to have to build this. Moving on to our parameters. So our parameters are basically like predefined filters that we want to use on this generic inquiry. In this example, we don't have any. But ones that may be a good example would be, in this case, we may want to have a parameter called customer number. And that means when I go in and look at this generic inquiry, I want to have a selection at the very top where I can select a customer And then at the bottom, it's only going to show me the results associated to that customer. For example, if I was looking at invoices, I may want to look at only invoices assigned to a certain customer. Another common one would be date range, right? I have a start date and an end date. So I want to tell it that these are values, these are parameters that I want to capture when somebody goes in and looks at this generic inquiry that I'm building. But that's only one part of it, because then what I have to do is use the conditions to define what that means. Just because I'm taking a start date and an end date, I have to tell it which fields to actually use those values in. And we'll come back to that and look at some examples of that a little later. Our grouping, grouping is a way for us to, when we display the values in our results, how do we want it to look? Grouping is, we could group by customer number, meaning that all of our customers are going to be put together in a group. Or we may want to group by invoice number if we were then including the detail of an invoice, the inventory items. So I want to see all of the invoices together, and I want to see all of their inventory items also with it. I don't want them to be scattered throughout the results. And then we have sort order. And sort order comes after grouping. Grouping always takes precedent over the sort. But once, if we don't have grouping, or once we have our grouping set, we then can say, well, how do I want to sort the data? Do I want to sort it by customer number? Do I want to sort it by invoice number, by date? So how do I want it to sort? And then obviously I have the option of doing ascending or descending. I don't have to set this. When I build a new generic inquiry, it'll automatically predefine a sort order for me, but it might give me a message saying that this has been predefined and you may want to configure it. So the results grid is really, Brad, what you were talking about in terms of this is what the end user is going to see when they go and look at the generic inquiry. So over here we have an object, which is nothing more than just the 3 tables that we had added into this generic inquiry on the tables tab. When I select which one I want to look at, I then can hit the data field and I can hit a drop down, and I get a list of all the data fields that are in that table. Now you can see these are the actual name of the field that's available to me. It's not the user-friendly name that you may see on the screen. And we'll look at a shortcut later on how to look at that. So we have some other stuff here. There's a little pencil here, which allows me to maybe build a little bit more of a complex result. So you can see I have some predefined functions here. If I select math, it'll give me kind of the syntax for how I would want to create something like that. But I can also use fields from my tables. So you can see it's kind of listing out my different tables here and the fields that are in those tables. So I can actually combine values together. If I had, let's say, things like quantity, I could combine those values because they're numbers. I can add them, subtract them, multiply them. I can do mathematical equations on it. Anytime I do any type of formula here, I would want to validate it, and it'll tell you if it passed or failed. And if it failed, it may give you a little bit of information about why it failed. Example of this is we've done ones where inventory quantity. So we may take the quantity on hand, meaning how many we have in the warehouse. We then subtract what's on sales order, because that's what's going to go out our door. And then we may add back in what the quantity on purchase order, because that's what we've ordered. And at the end result, we have a number of, well, this is what we're going to have after all these transactions have completed. You can also do it with, invoices, right? So dollars. So you can say, I have my taxable amount, my non-taxable amount, my tax amount. So you can do all types of different equations with it. We can also put in formulas like if statements. So let's say if this was a credit memo, I want to make it negative so that I see it as a negative value and not a positive value. So you can do a lot with these formulas here if you really needed to. Schema field basically represents what field in the database do I want to use for formatting purposes only, right? So again, if we were talking about doing the whole non-taxable plus taxable plus tax plus freight, At the end of the day, when I go and look at that, that's going to display to me as just a very big generic number with maybe a lot of decimal places. May not look very user friendly. And so I can use a field that's in the schema, let's say just taxable amount, as a way for me to format that field over to the left. It's just kind of a shortcut in terms of how to format things so that I can make it look nice. I can set the width of the column if I want. I can also look at different types of styles here. So here's styles that are available to me. And so you can do things like if it's meets a certain criteria, I want it to be red, I want it to be green. Maybe I just want it to be green all the time because I want it to stand out as a field that I want people to pay attention to. So you can do a lot with styles. This visible column represents basically, if we remember when we went back and we had that little button up here in the top left, and I can actually click on that here. Visible would be what by default is shown on the screen and is listed here. If it's visible as unchecked, means it would show up as available, but not be the default on the screen. Navigation deals with basically when it's a hyperlink. So it's blue, you can click on it, and it's going to take you somewhere. So normally navigation type or navigation to, default navigation means let the system do its thing. Navigation to is I've predefined it on this other navigation tab, and it's going to, I can define where it goes.
Understood.
Aggregate functions allow us to do some type of mathematics with it. This normally requires a little bit more advanced setup, but you can see I have options to do average, count, max, minimum, summary. And then like I mentioned, there are some other fields here. Probably the one that we use the most is this caption. And so caption, you can see it just added over here. So by default, when I add a data field, again, there's the name of the field that's in the system, meaning in the table, which is what we see on our screen now. And then there's the user-friendly name that we see on most screens, the one that, you know, makes sense to what it actually is. By default, the system's going to use that friendly username when we go and look at the results here. But in some cases, especially if I was to build my own formula, or in some cases it may be a little confusing, I can actually tell it, what do I want the header of this column to be? So I can give it my own name so I can move away from what the system tells me. I typically use this when we have multiple descriptions in one result grid, because it's always going to say just the word description, but it may not be very clear on what that description actually is. And so I may want to define
caption column is like an override for how it
Exactly.
displays. Is that right? Okay.
Right, exactly. What you see. So right here, when I look at this, when I'm looking at this width and style, similar type thing when I look at a regular generic inquiry. So yes, I can define what I want it to say. So I can tell it it's the inventory items description, it's the customer description, whatever it might be. Entry point is kind of more of for these predefined generic inquiries like customers. You can see it telling me what screen in the system do I want to use it as. We don't really deal with this very often. And then navigation is that hyperlink that we were just talking about. So by default, or when you build one, it typically will do pretty good at building its own navigation or hyperlink. But once in a while, you want to basically specify, yes, I want this column or I want this value to be a hyperlink, and I want it to go to a certain screen. And so in here, you can see I can come in here and I can add a new one, and I can choose which screen I want to go out to. I'm just kind of selecting one here. And you can see on this window mode, I can select, do I want it to open on the same tab, basically take me right to it? Do I want to create a new tab? Do I want to pop up a new window? Or do I want it to open up in like a side panel over to the right or left of my screen? So I have some flexibility in terms of the way I do this. And then if I come back to the one that's predefined, once I have the screen I want to point to, you then tell it which field am I using, and what is the parameter, where does that match to. So, this very useful when you're building a generic inquiry and you have a certain result and it's not linking out like you hoped it would, and you need to go in there and predefine it.